our little feathered friends, and basically try to give you guys tips to consistently get the photographs that you want out of birds. So I've been living in Alachua County for the last almost 10 years. So I recognize some faces here, but for those of you who do not know me, yes, my name is Mitch. I'm a PhD candidate here at UF. I study birds, specifically how they vocalize. I'm particularly interested in how different types of environmental change impact the way they sing. I work a lot in the urban environment. I also sample bird communities in pine habitat across the length of Florida to see how the effects of latitude influence vocal behavior and community structure. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. For once, I'm not going to be talking about my research. I'm going to be talking about another one of my favorite passions, of course, is bird photography. Here's me photographing a great blue heron at a site that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Sweetwater Wetlands Park. A lot of my shots actually that I'm going to be putting in this talk are actually from here. So just to let you know that, hey, you don't have to go to the far ends of the earth to get great photos. You can just really anywhere. There's always an opportunity waiting for itself. So, like I said, I've been photographing since I was in high school, and when I was in high school, I actually learned I learned photography through film photography. Remember film photography? I had to learn how to like wind film in the dark, and then put glossy pieces of paper in weird substances in hopes that my photos weren't all horribly overexposed. Right? It was that horrible like suspense. We've come a long way now, and as have I. And since it wasn't until my junior year of college when my dad, there he is, a fellow bird nerd, like everyone else here, he gave me an amazing Christmas gift. It was his Canon 5D camera and 100 to 400 millimeter lens. I still keep it with me, right? It's been slightly upgraded since I got it those many years ago, but the same setup still holds true. And ever since then, I have taken the camera with me everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Here in Costa Rica, with my dad. Hawaii, I was probably taking pictures of red-footed boobies or tropic birds of some type over there. Southern California, where I actually grew up, all the way to Texas, where I was taking pictures of roadrunners that were absurdly close to me. Needless to say, it's gotten a little out of control. And yeah, and if the roadrunner's telling you need to slow down, you know that you need to slow down. So yeah, it's been out of control, and I've loved every minute of it. And so, to me, bird photography is really a multifaceted activity, right? It, first and foremost, right, allows us to showcase the beauty and diversity of birds, right? A group of organisms we all cherish, right? And when you start photographing and you start talking to photographers, these are the types of shots right here that that many of them try to get. It's getting as close as you can to the bird with minimal background, all about the bird. And although I want to say that, yes, those are shots that you should definitely try to get because those are amazing. And it's great to get up close and personal with the birds. Birds are diverse. And so I believe that our bird photography should also be diverse. We don't always need to have the best cameras and the biggest lenses to get the best shots, right? We can sometimes take a step back, right, and admire the bird in its habitat. That can also be a very powerful image. This is a white ibis I took at Chapman's Pond, another familiar spot here in Alachua County, right? We can zoom in a little bit closer and still get an idea of what the bird's habitat is like, what its lifestyle is like this American goldfinch surrounded by native grasses up in Mount Rogers, Virginia. Or we can go the opposite way. We don't have to go super far. We can get really close, right? And we can capture the incredible contours and shadows and colors of a bird's plumage, like the sandhill crane taken at Sweetwater Wetlands Park. Or we can get close and capture expressive, goofy portraits of birds, right? And then sometimes we can say, you know what, forget the plumage. Let's just get the shape of the bird, right? The silhouette shot is also very powerful and can tell us, kind of a lot about the bird. So these are 3 sandhill cranes taken at, you guessed it, Sweetwater Wetlands on the ground. Also, here's some sandhill cranes taken in flight, not at Sweetwater, taken at the famous Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge in New Mexico. If you've never been, you should absolutely go so you can see thousands of these guys coming in to roost every night, as well as Canada geese. But, you know, birds don't just perch, right? A lot of bird photographers just take pictures of birds kind of just sitting there. And yes, they do look pretty, and we love the way they sit there and sing, but we also love the way birds behave, right? And so being able to capture that type of behavior can make an image a lot more powerful too. Whether it's two female anhinga battling each other, right? Or one of my favorite shots I took this year, which was a pileated woodpecker excavating a cavity out in Ocala National Forest. These little slices of life, these little snapshots, right? I think can really, you know, put us into that and put us into the shoes of birds and, you know, their crazy life. And we can also use bird photography as a means to show how birds are living in a changing world, a human-dominated world. Much of my work is done in the urban environment, right? And I've been able to witness a variety of invasive parrot species or exotic parrot species living in weird areas, like the sides of a building, the sides of a hospital in Miami, or monk parakeets out in building their little stick nests out in cell phone towers, right? Watching them adapt is quite amazing. But we can also zoom in a little bit and kind of see how birds are adapting to a human-dominated landscape in a more micro scale, right? Like this eastern towhee battling with its own reflection in a car mirror, right? So bird photography can be used in a variety of ways, and there's so many different avenues one can take. We don't need to always pigeonhole ourselves and take the same kind of shot. Before I actually get into the meat of the talk, I have a couple of questions that I would like people to answer in the chat. So if you could just answer these for me, they're very easy. The first one, can you just tell me yes or no? Have you done any bird photography before? Just tell me yes or no. I want to get an idea of where we're at here. Okay, so we've got some yeses. Judy, you have not done any photography. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for coming here for your first step. Okay, we have a few others, a few other yeses in there. A little, that's okay. Just starting, wonderful. Emily, no, wonderful. So we have some newcomers, we have some others, good, wonderful. And then this leads me to my second step, my second my second question. If you have done any bird photography, can you please tell me roughly how many years you have been photographing? So we can get an idea of where we're at. Okay, good. 5 is nice. 5 is solid. Not very long. 0.1. Debbie's been outside for literally 1 second with the camera. I think that's what that means. 4 years. 50. What does 50 mean? 50 years? Barb, that would be incredible. Okay, wonderful. So we have quite the range, okay? So for those of you who are just starting out, I hope that this isn't too overwhelming, and I hope that you learn a lot. And for those more seasoned in the bird photography realm, Barb, that's amazing. 50 years as an ecologist. Well done. Perhaps Barb should be giving this talk instead of me. But yes, for those of you like Barb or John, 10 years is quite a long time. Hopefully this isn't a snooze fest for you. Hopefully you guys can learn a thing or two as well. So here is the topic of discussion that we'll be going through, all right? Before we can even get ourselves outside and taking pictures of birds, right? We need to understand our camera. We need to understand how it operates. Every camera has has a manual, right? I'm not going to be going through a manual's worth of info, but there are some basic things that we all should know, and I'm going to be focusing on focus and exposure. Once we kind of get that topic, then we'll start to go into what do you do when you're outside, right? How do you position yourself, the bird, right? How do you approach the bird? How do you really make the best of what you have and what the bird's doing at that time, right? And then we'll kind of get into some more additional advanced tips at the end. And for anyone curious, this scissor-tailed flycatcher was the one that showed up in Jonesville a few years ago. I don't know if you all remember that. It was flying around in like the agriculture areas off the side of the road. Yeah, so I hung out with that bird for like 45 minutes and it was amazing. So I'm trying to put as many photographs from the county and stuff as I can just to show you, hey, you can get shots right around here. All right, so from the beginning, okay? So with the camera, So this is what a camera looks like, right? Typical camera. Now I shoot with Canon. So if you shoot with Nikon, the general concept is the same. The terminology might be a little bit different, but the overall concept of how things are organized and how you do stuff is pretty much the same in both, okay? This is generally how the camera looks. So before we even get into the different parts of the camera that are important to understand, first, it's important to know that there are two different types of photographs you can produce when you photograph. You can produce JPEG files or RAW files, okay? JPEGs, we all use JPEGs to send things for work and stuff, right? They're a compressed version of the RAW file, okay? So the pros mean that you can take a lot more photographs if you use JPEG files, less storage space. But to me, the cons heavily outweigh the pros. And the cons are that the JPEG image is going to be far lower in quality and much harder to manipulate in post-production. So things like if you have Photoshop, Lightroom, whatever, much harder. Whereas RAW files, they're raw, they're uncompressed, okay? They will fill up your memory card, yes, and they sometimes, if you are shooting at full RAW, you might come across a situation where you're trying to press the shutter and you can't. It's because the camera is trying to load all the images because it's a lot of file space. So it can sometimes kind of pause and the camera has to kind of buffer a bit. And that's probably the only downside. But really the quality of the image is so much better and it's so much easier to just manipulate and and make the shot look like exactly how it was in the field. So I shoot in RAW, for instance. So if you look on the lens of the camera, we're going to start in the realm of focusing, right? So all cameras have on the lens, they have an image stabilizer. I tend to keep the image stabilizer on because, you know, I tend to use the camera. I hand hold the camera. If you use tripods, right, there's probably not as much need to have an image stabilization. The idea is that, you know, your hands move. And so the image stabilizer reduces the shake that could, you know, affect the image. I tend to keep it on. And then you'll also see that there are two main focusing types: autofocus, manual focus. I use autofocus like 98% of the time, right? All I have to do is click, half click, right? Not a full click on the shutter, but a half click. It'll beep. And then the image that I've chosen is now or the subject I've chosen is now in focus. And then you can take the photograph, right? It's so much easier, so much faster to do that than manual. However, manual can be useful, okay? And for me, when there is too much vegetation around your bird, okay, and the autofocus is like, what's the bird, what's the vegetation, I can't tell, right? The manual focus allows you to do exactly what you want to do manually. So if there's too much stuff in the way, the autofocus can't discern, manual focus is great. And if the bird is sitting still, because once it starts to move, manual focus is going to be really hard to do. So an example of when manual focus saved my day was when I photographed this guy. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's one of my favorite birds in North America, is the wren tit. Since I am from Southern California, I grew up seeing these guys. And if you know anything about them, they love to hang out in really thick vegetation. They kind of just sit there and do their little ping pong ball call. And yeah, I had to manual focus and get that shot. And luckily the bird was sitting still, so it worked. The autofocus could not find this individual for the life of itself. So there's a scenario where that might happen. So if you go to the back of your camera, right, you go on the back, there's a screen there, right? And if you click on the screen, right, and if I click menu, okay, you see that I have the screen here. And all the things on here are pretty important to understand. So we're going to be kind of going through these one by one, okay? So we're still on the realm of focus, okay? So we'll start over here, okay? So AI Servo is one of 3 different types of autofocusing sort of techniques that you can use. So one shot is one option. I use this for still subjects. So an osprey is eating a fish and it's just sitting there, right? You can use one shot, okay? The camera will beep when the bird's in focus, right? You can actually press and hold and move the camera and move the bird in the frame, and it will keep that bird locked in focus. That's a trait that the one shot only does and none of the others do. On the extreme other end, you have AI Servo, and this is used for objects in motion. All right, so when you press the shutter halfway, it won't beep to tell you it's in focus, but it will focus. And what you can do is you can start to pan, right? And then it will continue to focus on stuff as you pan. So this is absolutely essential for birds in flight. I also use this. When I'm taking like pictures of little birds that love to move and stuff, like kinglets and warblers, because it just gets really tiresome to like have to press and press and press over and over again. Okay, so AI Servo is really good for that. And then AI Focus is kind of somewhere in between. If you're just starting out, AI Focus might be a nice one to use, because the camera kind of chooses for you, so it kind of does one or the other. But as I've started to photograph more and more, I tend to use AI Focus less, and I kind of focus on the one shot or the AI Servo. But AI Servo is probably what I have on most of the time, because birds are, hey, they're always moving, right? So then we can move into the focusing point, right? This is like, you decide where the point is of focus and how many focusing points you want, okay? So generally, we like to focus on the bird's eye. Once the eye is in focus, the rest of the bird kind of stays nice and balanced, right? So that's where you really want to try to hone in on, right? Or whatever, if you're focusing on a different part of the body, maybe the legs, right? You focus on the legs, but generally, right, the eye is where it's at, okay? So here, at least in my camera, these are all the different types of autofocus points, okay? Starting from the finest point to the left, okay, and then moving to the broadest or largest number of points, right? I think there are 64 in total, so you can go all the way to the right here and have 64 autofocusing points, okay? So when is it good to use one versus the other, okay? So I often have my camera set to these first two, right? For still subjects or large birds in flight, this gives me complete control of what I want to stay in focus, right? But when is it useful to have multiple focusing points? Okay, so definitely smaller birds in flight. Okay, like try to photograph a tree swallow with a single focusing point. It's basically impossible, right? If you have more focusing points, that increases the chance that the camera is going to lock onto that bird and get a crisp shot. Okay, so that's when I tend to use that. You also want to be careful, because if the background of your bird in flight has tons of vegetation around it, right, the camera might end up focusing on some of the stuff there. So generally, if there's a sky background, small little bird moving around, or a flock of birds, right, you're trying to get the whole flock in focus, okay, then multiple focusing points. And if you get into the more fine details of it, there's ways that you can lock focusing points, but that's a little bit more complicated. But yes, but for the most part, I'm usually using these first two on the far left there. So that's the basic makeup for focus. Now, what about exposure? There are three main things with exposure: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. If you can knock these three down, you will pretty much get a wonderfully exposed image every time. So the aperture. Okay, this might be reviews for some of you, and I apologize, but I always like reviews anyway, even if I'm familiar with it. You can think of the aperture, right, as the pupil in your eye, right? If you're in a dark area, right, your pupil gets really big to bring in more light. Same thing with a camera aperture, right? The idea is that you're going to be taking light, and it's going to and the light's going to go onto the image sensor of the camera, and that's how the image will be produced. So you're controlling how much light is coming in. So if you have a small f-stop or a wide aperture, you are bringing in a lot of light. Okay, and if you have a very narrow aperture, right, you're bringing in very little light. The second thing that it does is it changes the depth of field. So if you have a wide aperture, then you tend to have a very blurry background. You have very low depth of field. You're pretty much, like, if you want to just focus on the bird and nothing else, you want a low f-stop, a wide aperture. But if you want to take a picture of the bird plus the trees behind it, plus the mountains and the clouds, then you want to get a narrower aperture to increase that depth of field. So I decided to take some photographs myself at Sweetwater to kind of show you how some of this stuff works. Now, I know this isn't a bird, so let's not all get, oh, I thought this was a bird talk. What is this doing here? This is the best example I could come up with. So yeah, here we go. I mean, who doesn't like a little cottontail? So Here is the shot taken at f5.6. This is the lowest f-stop, the widest aperture that my camera goes to on my lens. So as you can see, right, it really accentuates this guy in the front here. We can barely tell what's going on in the background, right? It's completely blurred. Now, if I increase that f-stop, now all of a sudden, we start to see a little bit more about what's going on. We see blades of grass, we see some vines, and hey, what do you know? There's another cottontail back there, right? So it allows us to increase the clarity of things behind the subject. But narrowing the aperture, narrowing the aperture can also sharpen images to the left and right of our subject, okay? So these goofballs, these burrowing owls I photographed in South Florida, right? If I had shot this at f5.6, Tweedledee on the left and Tweedledum on the right there would probably be a little bit out of focus. But because I shot at f10, I was able to get all three of them in focus and capture all their I love burrowing owls. They're probably the most expressive bird out there. And so being able to get all of them together was quite nice. If you want to capture a flock, right, in focus, right, that means that you have to increase the depth of field so that you get multiple individuals, right? That's another opportunity where you might want to use like a greater depth of field. Or if you're trying to take pictures of big birds in flight, right? Hawks, eagles, cranes, storks, the tips of those flight feathers and those tails, right? They will get blurred if you shoot at a low f-stop, okay? Especially like the really big guys. So I tend to shoot at like a higher f-stop so that I can make sure that all the feathers are in focus of these big guys, okay? Now, the downside to shooting at a higher f-stop is that you do bring in less light, right? Which is why we often shoot at f5.6 because we want to have the most light. And that's where we move in. And why is that? It's because we move into our next part, which is shutter speed. So what exactly is the shutter? So you can think of the shutter as like this little kind of, like these little like a little window protector of our sensor. And the sensor is where the image is going to be processed. So it opens and closes at a certain speed. And the speed with which the shutter opens to bring in light and close is called the shutter speed, okay? And so once again, if you increase the shutter for a long time, right, it's going to bring in more light. So when things are super dark, right, if you want to try to get like those crazy, night sky shots, they can have the aperture open for like 30 seconds, right? But for bird photography, we tend to like to have things on the higher end, the faster, right? Because birds twitch and move and do stuff. And we want to freeze that motion. So a higher shutter speed is best, okay? It freezes motion, but it will bring in less light, okay? So as a rule of thumb, you want the shutter to be roughly the inverse of your focal length. So if you're shooting at 400 millimeters, all right, shooting at least 1/400th of a second will maximally increase the chances that you'll get shots, without blur, okay? So that's why we tend to shoot at lower or at wider apertures, because then our shutter ends up becoming a lot faster, okay? Now, going back to the menu there, that seems like a lot to keep track of. Like, how do I tell what aperture, what shutter to do? This seems crazy. Well, fortunately, there are some easier ways to do this, right? The camera can do some stuff for you. So I always have my camera pretty much set to AV, or aperture priority mode. That means I choose the aperture and then the camera chooses the shutter based off that aperture, because I understand aperture a lot better than I know shutter speed, right? Like if I want to control like how many things are in focus and how much light's coming in, aperture makes sense to me. Camera chooses the shutter speed for me, okay? And remember, you can still get sharp photos at low shutter speeds, right? But you just have to hope that that bird is staying pretty still, because once it moves, right, in a dark setting like that, it'll get blurred. So let's say you get your aperture and your shutter speed and you're still not quite getting the exposure you want, slightly overexposed, underexposed. There is a third element, and this is the ISO, okay? Lower ISO, all right, will make the image darker. Higher ISO, once again, brings in more light, but there is a cost. As you increase your ISO, the image gets a lot grainier, and that's not very pretty, okay? Fortunately, the newer cameras out these days do a very good job at creating really good images at high ISO. When I started, right, with my Canon 5D years and years ago, if I took anything at 800 or higher, forget it. It was noise city, and it was awful. There was nothing I could do. Well, now with my 7D Mark II, I can go out to Bowling Bluff and shoot at ISO 3200 and get perfectly fine shots. And with a teeny little bit of denoising and post-production, no problem whatsoever. So that's fortunate. So really, we can really maximize the chances of getting the exposure that we want with aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Now, there may be a little bit of fine tuning that comes around. Okay, so you have this little dial here. This is an exposure dial. Okay, I often will increase the dial part way up, part way down if things are still not quite right. So for instance, when the background is a lot brighter than your subject, so this happens almost every time you take a picture of a bird in flight. All right, if you get the sky, you know, exposed, the bird's gonna be totally dark. So one thing I like to do is anytime I'm going to be taking pictures of birds in flight, I will increase the exposure meter up here to almost 1 often. And that usually increases the chance that the bird will also be exposed. On the flip side, if you're in a dark environment and the bird is brighter than the surrounding environment, you may get an issue of overexposure on your bird. So when I tend to go to places like Bowling Bluff where I know it's going to be dark, I tend to decrease the exposure just a little bit. And that pretty much, like that shot I took of the black and white warbler, that was actually taken at Bowling Bluff, and I did that exact thing, and that helps a lot. So it's a lot to keep track of. These are a lot of things. I mean, the amount of times I forgot to change my ISO is astounding. So like, you know, this takes time. So I hope that that makes sense. Okay, and then you can also play around with a little bit of color or white balance. Okay, so there are various settings with the white balance. Okay, so you have auto white balance. This is basically going to give you a different tone of color. Okay, and then for my camera and for most cameras, you have a bunch of other different types of displays. The tungsten, white fluorescent, flash, I like never use those, but auto, daylight, shade, cloudy, those I do use. And generally what happens is in areas where you're going to get less color, so shade, cloudy environments, right? If you set it to the shade cloudy display, it'll boost the temperature, or essentially boost the color and the sepia tone and add a little bit of extra color, okay? But if you're in daylight, where there's a lot of light coming in, right? If you actually keep it on cloudy, it's gonna make the image look really sepia and like super, like too high a temperature, and it's gonna not look very nice. So those are things to kind of keep track of. Just as an example, I wish I took these photographs, but I didn't. This is from a video I was watching. This is what they all kind of look like, okay? So to me, you can kind of decide what you think looks best, but the shady one, right, that's the one where you have the highest temperature. And you can kind of see that it looks a little bit yellowy, sepia-y, right? And then the auto white balance to me looks like it has too little color. But the daylight and cloudy, I think those are the ones that kind of look the nicest in my opinion. Okay, so you can, again, post-production, you can adjust these things, but these are one thing. These are some things that I sometimes forget to do. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so that's focus and exposure. Great. There's a lot of other stuff to go on in the manual, but now you have a general understanding of how your camera works. Now let's go outside. So what do you do when you're outside? So we're going to talk about how you get close to your bird. How do you position yourself? And then how do you position the bird in the frame? Okay, so getting close. We all don't have massive lenses, right? We don't have the money to do that. I've never had the amount of money to do that, so I've always had to find creative ways to get close. So one of the best things to do is to approach a bird slowly and at an angle if possible. So when we see something that we really want to photograph, we tend to just want to beeline it to that bird, and that's pretty much the last thing you want to do, because that's going to make you look like a predator. The bird's going to freak out and it'll probably fly away, okay, or move away from you, right? And we're always trying to pick up signs of distress from the bird. So the minute it starts to poke its head up and look at you or start making noise or walk away, that's when you know, okay, that's about as close as I can go. Okay, so always watch for those signs and approach slowly. And like I said, I tend to kind of go in increments. So I'll kind of walk around the bird, come at a different angle, and then as I take a few steps closer, I take some photographs. come a little closer, take some photographs, come a little closer, because the bird can fly away at any point. And so I want to try to get as close as I can and take shots before it does that, okay? So another thing you want to do is potentially anticipate where the bird might be. So this has happened a few times in my life, and most recently it happened with one of the biggest celebrities that Gainesville has had in the bird world. That was with our yellow cardinal. So I remember seeing this bird, right, like we all have, and the first time I went there, I was at the boardwalk like everybody else, and I was kind of watching the bird, and I wasn't really that satisfied with the shots I was getting. The bird was kind of flying high up on the tree with the sky behind it, and I just didn't really like the situation. So I ended up kind of just sort of at the end of it, I just sort of watched the bird and just sort of looked at where he liked to forage. And I noticed that he liked to kind of come around the backside closer to the parking lot. And so the light kind of got bad, and so I ended up coming back the next day, and instead of going onto the boardwalk, I just sat on the grass in this other patch, and lo and behold, the little gold guy came crawling right there. I was able to get a nice shot, and then a bunch of people figured out that the bird was there, and they crowded around me, and the bird ended up sort of disappearing into the brush. But this was a situation where I didn't have to come to the bird. The bird kind of came to me because I kind of knew what it was trying to, where it liked to move to. Okay, this is also true for hummingbirds. Now I know Gainesville is not the hummingbird capital of the world, but hummingbirds, especially in the breeding season, are excellent for this because males are super territorial and they have specific perches that they love to go to. So if you figure out what those perches are, right, you can just sit right next to the perch. Like for this Anna's hummingbird in San Diego, I was 5 feet from the perch, and the bird just boop, came right back to it. I had the lighting set up the way I wanted, and I was able to get this shot, right? This is also true for birds that have roosts or birds that have nests, but I really caution with nests, right? Because once again, we don't want to disturb the birds, but if you can figure out areas where birds like to frequent, then that makes your life a lot easier, right? And then of course, if you have a blind, that's awesome, right? Or using a kayak, cars are really good ways to get closer to birds. Birds seem to be a lot more chill if you're in one of those things than you're walking around. Or if you have camouflage, can certainly help, right? Walking around in like bright yellow is probably not the best idea. Now, what do you do about positioning yourself? Okay, so we just talked about how you approach the birds. Now, how do you position yourself? Generally speaking, unless you want to get a picture, unless you want to get a silhouette type shot, right? You really want the sun behind you, okay? So I'll give you an example. So when I was in Ocala National Forest, okay, here's a Bachmann Sparrow, okay, doing its little call, little beep, 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 beep. It was doing that thing. It was awesome. It was so hard to photograph this little guy. Either the vegetation was in the way, and I finally got a spot where the bird was not surrounded by vegetation and the sun was to my right, and it just didn't quite capture it, right? It creates these shadows, right? And it just doesn't quite work. So eventually I had to kind of do my approach technique where I kind of walked in increments and walked around the bird until I got the sun behind me. And eventually I was able to get a shot like this, which I think is a lot cleaner, a lot nicer. There was still a lot of vegetation in the way. So some major critics might be like, there's too much stuff in the way. But given the situation, this is the best I could have done. And I'm very happy with this shot. But it took me quite a while. I probably spent like 30, 45 minutes with the bird without stressing it out to get this kind of shot. Also, so keep the sun behind you. Try to get eye level with the bird, right? Getting eye level with the bird, it just makes the shot a lot more aesthetically pleasing because it's like we're at its level. Like this is how the bird's sort of height is. When we start taking pictures of birds from above them, it just doesn't seem natural, okay? So here's a photograph I took at Sweetwater of a great blue heron. You can literally take a picture of this guy every time you go, right? But like how Sweetwater is a little tricky because everything's kind of sloped downward, that we often get shots like this. But I was able to then crouch down and was able to get a shot that looked like this. Again, maybe not perfect. We still have a little bit of that vegetation in the way, but this is a much more aesthetically pleasing type image. And it's the best that I could do when I was out there. But getting eye level can really, I think can really make the shot a little bit more appealing. And a really important one, okay, is watching your background, okay? look at the background behind the bird, because all it might take is just a few little steps of movement, and you can really improve the shot. So I'll give you an example. Here's an osprey looking at me, and we're both wondering who's the goofier looking thing. So behind him, you can see that there is quite a bit of green vegetation and then little pockets of sky, right? And I find it to be a little distracting, right? It's just, it doesn't really make the bird pop. So all I had to do was take a couple of side steps to my left, and I was able to get a shot that looked like this. So now I've completely removed the vegetation and I've created this whiteout, okay? And it really makes the bird pop. But then I tried, let's go the opposite way. Let me step a couple of steps to the right, and then the same exact bird on the same perch. Now we have basically no sky and it's all green. And depending on what you prefer, I kind of like the image on the far right, but both the second and third image, right, I think the background's a lot less distracting, okay? And so getting a less distracting background is best, unless you're, trying to get a picture of a bird in the background or something going on in the background, right? But if you're just interested in the bird and nothing else, trying to get a background that's not very distracting is best. So here's some other celebrities we had at Sweetwater. Remember these little guys? They've grown up since then. They're quite large now. But once upon a time, the Sweetwater cranes were very tiny and adorable. And everybody was out there trying to get photographs of these guys. So I walked up to them the first time I saw them, and it was like this. The birds are in focus, right? I'm fairly eye level with them. But again, the background just doesn't quite work for me, right? It's a bit messy. So I moved my way in front of the birds and got eye level and was able to get a shot like this, which I think the background is is far less distracting, right? Even with the other bird there, with the adult there, it just really makes the birds pop a little bit more. So this is where you just have to kind of explore what you have around you. One other example, here's a pair of black-crowned night herons. We've got an adult in the front, a young in the background, and some awful urban structure in the background that's very distracting, and I don't like it. So all I had to do is move to my right. It's removed, and the image, I think, is a little bit cleaner and a little bit less distracting. And our eyes are immediately drawn to the bird. Okay, and then we have how do we position the bird? Great. Now we've taken our photograph. Okay. Now, how do we position it right? Okay. So this image of a lovely little snowy plover I took at, where was that at? That was up in, was that, I think it was, near St. Augustine at the monument up there. Nicely exposed, even shows a little bit of behavior, right? He's calling. But being in the middle of the frame is generally when we are just talking about photography, having the subject in the middle of the frame is never quite pleasing. And so you might have heard of this rule of thirds, right? And the idea is that we try to get the body of the bird, at least this top part of the bird, on one line, and maybe the legs on the other line, and maybe get the eye or some major drawing point of the bird on one of these intersections. That's kind of the idea. So if I try to do that to the best of my ability, okay, here we go. I move the bird like this. And yeah, I agree. I think it makes the shot a little bit more aesthetically pleasing than it was when it was sitting in the middle there, right? So we generally like to give, wherever the bird's looking, we want to kind of give space in the photo, right? So if I move the bird over here, right, he's not looking to the right, he's looking to the left, and then the picture's cut off, like it doesn't work. So giving space to where the bird's looking, I think also makes it nice. We can also use lines to direct ourselves to the bird. Okay, so here's a great horned owl that I photographed at Alachua Trail, probably one of the best places to photograph these guys, right? And I just love the silhouette, and I love how the lines of these branches just sort of, you follow them and it goes right to the bird. I really like how that turned out, right? Here's another one of that same Anna's hummingbird I took earlier, right, in San Diego. Okay, this bird is pretty much following the rule of thirds exactly, but then it just adds to it with that branch that you just guides it nicely and comfortably to the bird right there. Okay. We can also, kind of adjust things vertically and use reflections, right? So here we kind of create balance, right? Because we have half of the bird above and its reflection on the other half, right? The eyes are still not in the middle of the frame, that you're still following the rule of thirds, and we create kind of a nice a nice balance that way, okay? And here's another bird that I actually, this is a least grebe I photographed in Florida. It was all the way out in Key Biscayne. Crazy that it was out there. Once again, follows the rule of thirds. And generally speaking, when you take reflection shots, you like to kind of get all of the reflection in there. If I cut it off, it just makes the photo look incomplete. Okay, so this is often, you know, you can sometimes do this in the field, but often this is a post-production thing. You start to manipulate it and you're like, oh, this is the best way to crop the image. Okay, but these are things that you may want to think about. Okay, so we're at 7:43, doing great on timing. So now we're going to go into our additional tips, or more advanced tips. Okay, so one thing I really like to do when I'm photographing is I like to take a pre-shot before the bird shows up, right? So if it is like that hummingbird on its perch, I'm going to take a picture of the perch before the bird shows up to make sure that everything's exposed. So the last thing you want to do, the bird comes and you've been waiting for 30 minutes and all of a sudden you photograph and you just, the settings were set to something you photographed earlier, right? And then everything's out of whack. So taking that pre-focused shots, right? Even if you can tell, if you can see the bird and it's about to move into frame, just take a quick one, look, because now all we have to do is just take a picture and look, and we can immediately tell how things are, right? That always helps, okay? Yeah, so yeah, focus on a nearby branch, right? Or something that has the same lighting situation so that you are ready to go when the bird shows up. Now, one thing I kind of learned about in the last year or two is the customized settings. So if you go into the dial where you can change the manual, there's AV mode, the aperture priority mode, you'll start to notice that you have these customized settings. Now, these are really cool because let's say you are photographing a limpkin and it's just sitting there. And then all of a sudden, we've probably seen this happen to each of us. And all of a sudden, an osprey comes by with this big old fish in its talons, and you're just like, oh my God. And you just scramble with your camera and you try to make these setting changes, and then it's gone. And then you're just like, oh my God, it's ruined. Well, the good news is that you can reduce that situation by creating customized settings. So I often have my C1 and C2 set to bird flight photography. So you can tell it that I want the camera to be set to these various settings when I'm going to take something in flight. So then when that opportunity arises, all you have to do is just move from AV to C1 and boom, you're there. That's how I was able to get this shot of that exact thing I was complaining about, right? This guy, I was literally taking a picture of a limpkin, and then this guy came right on over and I set it to C1 and I got the shot and it was great. And I would have never gotten that if I had scrambled, okay? And try to do that, right? So the customized settings are really, really cool. But you're gonna probably have to adjust them each day, right? Because the lighting situation will be different each time. Okay, here's another really cool one. So I call it Find Your Birds. So look for Photo Pro birds, finding birds that are gonna be obliging, right? So you can do that locally, right? So if you're just starting out doing photography, like go out to Sweetwater and like walk the boardwalk and see if a limpkin hops up on there, or find those cranes, right? That, you know, without disturbing them, of course, but they're very tame, right? These are great birds to kind of practice with stuff like that, right? And you can start to learn the exposure, right? This was a double-crested cormorant that like just, yeah, hopped up on the boardwalk, and it just allowed me to play with the settings a bunch, right? So learning where you can find birds to do that, or species or individuals that are gonna, you know, aid in that kind of stuff, totally go for that. And also eBird. We all use eBird for bird watching, but you can totally use it for bird photography. Here's an example. So last winter, or spring, I really wanted to get a shot of a snowy plover. I'm sorry, I said it was a snowy plover earlier. I think it was piping plover. Piping plover. I teach the avian biology class here. How disappointing. Yeah, piping plover, right? So I wanted to get a picture of a piping plover, okay? We don't have piping plovers in Gainesville, so how the heck am I supposed to find an individual, not only an individual, but an individual that I can photograph? Well, right, eBird allows you to have that photo app. So what I do is I look on eBird and I look at spots that not only are getting a high number of individuals, but have a high number of photo symbols, because that tells me that these birds may be photographable, okay? Now, once again, I always say this with a grain of salt because you don't want to stress the bird out, right? But I often do this because it allows me to increase the chance of having a good trip. So I went to the Fort Matanzas Peninsula and I went out onto the sandbank there. And yeah, lo and behold, not only did I get nice shots of our piper, but I also got nice shots of other things that were coming in really close and didn't care that I was there. And yes, I did stay out on the sandbank for too long and I almost missed the tide. And I had to carry my bag above me as the water was like this high up. So I was just having such a blast out there, right? But yeah, so eBird can be a great tool to locate stuff, right, outside of your area. And the other thing is to watch out for behavior and look at your surroundings, okay? So behavior, right? Behavior can always add a little flair to a photo. So here's a nice little Western kingbird. Actually, this was taken in Southern California. I sat with this guy at a vineyard. I know I was drinking wine and taking photos of birds. It's pretty much paradise. And then, you know, this is a nice photograph. It's cropped well, clean background, nicely exposed. But then just a few seconds later, the bird did this and it added a little bit more. I don't think he was calling, he was kind of just like stretching, right? And it just adds a little bit more to it, right? Right, here's another, again, at the vineyard. Here's a yellow-rumped warbler, just sitting there. But then sometimes, you know, getting them when they do something else. They take off, right? This adds a little bit more movement, a little bit more to it. So never be afraid to try to capture the bird doing stuff. I think it adds a lot more power to the image. And then look at the surroundings, okay? So I love the shot of a sedge wren. This was years ago at Tuscaloosa Prairie here in Alachua County, right? It's a nice photograph. It's a little bit shaded, but a little bit of shadows there, but still nice. But I looked around the bird and noticed, oh, whoa, its background is really pretty. And so I zoomed out and was able to get a shot like this, which I think is better than the one up close, right? So always just take a little look around and see what you have in your surroundings. You'd be surprised. You may have a beautiful display of Spanish moss behind you, and it's going to really add to the photograph, especially if the bird's just sitting there, right? Like, might as well play around. So in this final little snippet here, I'm going to just briefly mention a little bit of ethics here, right? These are things you want to really kind of avoid, okay? So if you're with a crowd of people, right, don't like crowd around the bird, chase the bird. A big one is playback. Now, I know we like to use playback when we were doing bird watching, and I think, you know, that's okay to a point, right? Because it doesn't take much to like see the bird with a playback, but people can be a little bit too heavy on the playback when you're trying to photograph, because seeing the bird is not enough, right? Because you have to get the bird up close, which means you have to bring it closer and closer to you and continue to piss it off and stress it out more and more. So, and as a result, a lot of photography contests like Audubon, right? They're actually excluding, they're not allowing you to upload photos where playback was used, right? So like even the contests are starting to move away with that. So that's something that, something to kind of think of. And again, be wary of nests, of places that, you know, could stress the bird out. And I think it's important to remember that not every bird photo has to be award winning. I think that's one thing that bird photographers are constantly thinking, and I myself, especially when I travel far to a place, right? You know, it's tempting to want to just keep pursuing the bird because I don't know if I'm ever going to see that. I kind of had a little bit of that when I was up in Alaska taking pictures of the eiders. Like, when the heck am I going to go back up to North Alaska and see Steller's eider? Like, maybe I will, and good for me. But if, you know, so it gets in your head a little bit. But remember, you know, it doesn't have to be award winning, right? There are plenty of great experiences that come without having the amazing photograph. So don't reach for a photo, right? Don't be a Christina Ricci, okay? We don't need to do it. We don't need to force it, okay? Enjoy it. And then it'll make you feel a lot better going away being like, oh, hey, the bird was not stressed and I enjoyed myself, okay? Because you see it all the time with bird photography. You see so many disregards to ethics, probably more than like any other art form. So just keep that in mind. And with that, I believe that is everything that I have to say for you today. Thank you guys so much. And I am open for any questions you have for the remaining 8 minutes here.
I'll go ahead and give, oh, actually participants have you can, and if anyone wants to unmute yourselves, you're welcome to.
yeah, if you want to talk or do you want to send something in the chats, I'd be happy to hear it. Anything at all? If not, that's totally fine. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys enjoyed the, do you recommend any lens filters? Okay, great. We're going to go right into the nitty gritty. So I've used filters every once in a while. I think filters are really good for like sunset type stuff. So if you're out taking pictures in like kind of harsh lighting, I think filters can be really helpful in like more landscape type stuff. You want to get that like that sunlight, that those sun rays coming through the light right there. Like the filters can be helpful there. I know a lot of people that like shoot in the snow, right, where you have like, you know, where it's super white and like it's just really bright at you, right? Like sometimes filters can be useful there. So I actually don't have any recommendations. I haven't really used much in the way of filters, but there are plenty of good resources out there. It's one of the things I've been meaning to actually look into. But yeah, anytime you have really harsh lighting that you need, that you're going to be consistently in, you may want to look into that. Really good question though. Okay. Yes, the term playback. So meaning that someone uses a phone or a speaker and broadcasts the bird's song from your speaker to attract the bird to you, right? This is a incredibly common technique in, you know, bird guiding and stuff, because people are paying you to see birds. So, you know, so people use playback to bring the bird in. Oh, everyone see it, great, and then you move on. And that my whole thing is that, you know, if you do it very quickly and the bird's there and everyone sees the bird and you're done, that's all well and good. But for bird photography, because you want to get that perfect shot, sometimes people just use playback for way too long and just to try to get the bird exactly where they want to. And that's where I think that that's maybe, you know, that's not really my cup of tea. And I think that that's just a personal preference. Warblers are one of my downfalls. What settings would be best for these fast little guys to get more than blurs? Okay, Robin, excellent question. So yes, warblers are really difficult because not only are they little blurs, but they also often are way up in the canopy, and that's tricky. So I remember reading or listening to a live stream of a really, really good photographer, and he got these amazing photographs of warblers. And a lot of it is because he knows where to find them. Like whether it's nest or like he knew like what time of the year the plants were budding, and then like the leaves were not going to be super big and distracting, and he knew that like the birds like to frequent there at these times. So it was really planned. So I want to let you know that a lot of these shots and stuff that bird photographers are doing, you know, like it's calculated. Sometimes, yeah, they may go out and just, oh, hey, you know, and you just happen to get that great shot of a prothonotary. But oftentimes with warblers, it's very, very planned, and they know exactly how the bird operates, and you know they set it up that way. But in general, I set the ISO to, I set to AI Servo, so I can constantly so I'm panning and always focusing, right, because the bird's gonna be moving all the time, so I want to be able to consistently focus and focus quickly. So AI Servo, I tend to have the ISO kind of high because often I find warblers in darker areas, so I try to bring in as much light as possible. Yeah, and lower that aperture, make the aperture quite wide so you can bring as much light as possible. But yeah, they're really tricky. If you can get them eye level with you, it's going to make your life a lot easier, and it's going to make the picture a lot better. But that's hard to do. Let's see. Oh, good. I'm glad you like custom settings. I thought those were really cool when I found out about that. Yeah, polarizing filters are the way to go. Wonderful. Of course, no problem. I love sharing my stuff to you guys. I'm glad you appreciate it. Do you ever use auto ISO? So here's the thing. When I started doing photography, I was using auto for a lot of things because I didn't know what I was doing. And so, yeah, so I was using auto ISO in the beginning. I even set my camera to the P mode, which is program mode, which means it sets the aperture and shutter speed and like everything. And you start to learn is that the camera's not perfect. In fact, most of the time it doesn't do the best of jobs, but once you start to learn how the camera works, you start to drift further and further away from the auto stuff, but you just have a better understanding of what you want. But when you're just starting out, there's no shame at all in using the auto stuff. So yes, I did use it when I was starting out, but yeah, since then, I kind of have an idea. I kind of know which ISOs I want to set to in certain scenarios. But yeah, totally. Auto is a great way to go. I mean, I sometimes use the auto white balance because that can be kind of tricky to discern in the field. But yeah, I'll just be caution with that in the future because the camera doesn't always get it right. But yeah, it can. I mean, I've gotten some great shots on auto settings. So yeah, I'm sure it works great. These are all great questions, by the way. Oh, sweet. From the Macaulay Library. That's interesting. I wonder what it was that they used of mine.
It's the best warbler.
Oh man. Yeah, not a great photograph, but that was an amazing. I don't know who found that, but that was incredible. It's the only time I've ever seen that bird. I've never seen the Brewsters. I've never seen the other form, so that'll be next time. But I think the Lawrence's is kind of the prettier version, so I was excited to see that one. But yeah, I was snooping around trying to get a shot of that bird as well, and just didn't.
I think you were the last person to see it. I found it that morning after like one of the Wednesday wetland walks.
Oh yeah,
but yeah, you were the last person to see it.
Oh well, yeah. I mean, see. That doesn't make me look good. Now everyone's gonna think that I scared it away. I swear. I was just minding my own business and watching him, and yeah, and he was hanging out in a really difficult place to access, and I was like, forget it. Just I got a shot, and you move on. But yeah, if there are no other questions, yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for allowing me to speak to you all. I hope you all learned something today, whether you are just starting out or have been doing it for quite some time. Yeah, my Instagram is there. I always upload new stuff. I try to when I can. I got a PhD, so that's priority one. But yeah, if you ever see me out there with my camera at Sweetwater, I'm out there all the time. Like, don't hesitate to come over and talk to me. I love photographing with people too. So yeah, I'm sure I'll see you guys around. But thank you so much, and yeah, hope you all get out there and try photography a little bit. And yeah, if you want to email me about, I didn't talk at all about like equipment. That's a whole other thing. But if you have any questions about anything, just like you want to make your first purchase, feel free to shoot me an email. I can give you some advice. B&H Photo is a great place to start. B&H Photo. Start there in terms of, oh, whoops, I sent that just to, Tim. But yeah, B&H Photo is great to actually purchase stuff, but there's all sorts of great videos and links of things that people review stuff, and you can really get an idea of what's best. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys. And yeah, good luck with your photography, and I hope to see you all out there.